Good afternoon, brethren. Great to be here today. It was an easy drive for me. The streets were so empty. I hear there's some kind of big holiday going on. Well, the Valley of Elah is a place of strategic importance in the land of Israel. And that is where, during the Crusades, the armies of Saladin fought against the Knights of the Crusade. Hundreds of years before that, it's where the Jewish Maccabees revolted against Rome and fought battles there. And before that, it was the site of a battle between the Philistines and the Israelites and the famous warriors David and Goliath. During that time, the Philistines wanted to take over Israelite territory, and if they could control the battle or the Valley of Elah, it would mean that they could divide the nation of Israel in two. The problem is, the Valley of Elah is basically a riverbed with hills on each side. And so the Philistines came from the south, and King Saul knew that that was happening, and so he took his armies and gathered along the north. The problem was, if you're the Philistines and you want to get to the Israelites, you have to descend down into the valley, and then you have to climb up the hill and attack going uphill, while your enemies have the advantage of the high ground, fighting you downhill. And likewise, if King Saul wanted to repel the Philistines, they would have had to do the same thing, going down their hill into the valley and then climbing and fighting their enemy uphill. And so neither side wanted to do that because it would have been suicide, so it was a stalemate. For quite a few days, it was a stalemate. But there actually was a way out of that, and it's not something that they invented. The Philistines proposed that each side choose a champion to represent them in a duel to the death, and the winner, that army would be considered the winner of the other army. The other army would surrender. And that was commonly done, not just in that battle, but even up into Roman times. Each side would choose a champion and live with the results because that would save so much bloodshed. And of course, the Philistines had a pretty good champion, right? A giant, super strong, with a javelin, with a spear that's said to be thick as a weaver's beam, with a sword, with a helmet, with full body armor that is said to weigh 150 pounds. His sword, or his spear alone, was 15 pounds, just the head of the spear, and it was weighted and could penetrate not only through shield and through the armor into to the opponent and kill him. So he was pretty much unstoppable given his size and what he could wear. The Israelites also had a champion, and that was David. David, of course, was not as big as Saul. He was pretty weak, in fact, and he couldn't even walk in Saul's armor when Saul offered that to him. You all know that story. And so you would think that it's going to be pretty much a lopsided battle. And you were right, but maybe not in the way that you think. Because back then, just like today, there are three types of fighters, three categories: cavalry, infantry, and artillery. So nowadays, cavalry means tanks, quick moving. Infantry means men on foot. And then artillery nowadays means cannons, but back in the day, it meant archers or slings. Cavalry nowadays means tanks, but back in the day, it meant people on horses. So no one of those categories was any better than the other. It was more like a game of rock, scissors, paper. So if you're infantry, you can beat the cavalry by lining up your spears, and the horses run, and the horses get stabbed by the spears. So you can take down the cavalry if you're infantry. And likewise, the cavalry can beat the artillery because they're going so fast that you can only get so many arrows off before you're overwhelmed by the horses. And then artillery beats the infantry because the infantry is slow moving and they're short range, and the arrows or the slings are long range. Now, Goliath was infantry, David was artillery. Think about David's sling. Medieval paintings show slingers as hitting birds in mid-flight. Now, I was at Mr. Keeney's house, and we did some clay pigeon shooting, and I had the luxury of having a shotgun, and even with that, it was pretty hard to hit things in mid-flight. I couldn't imagine doing it with a slingshot, but these were not hobby slingshots. These were well-trained people who were able to take out those targets. The Irish had a history of using slingshots in war, and it was said that their warriors could hit a coin from as far away as they could see the coin. Judges 20:16 describes slingers in the Israelite army, and it says that everyone could sling a stone at a hair's breadth and not miss. An experienced slinger could hit a target at up to 200 yards away. So the People's Church down the road, that's 30 yards. And Arby's is 600 yards. So a third of the way to Arby's on 82nd Street would be 200 yards. So David said, I killed bears and lions, and he could do that, and he did it. But he didn't do it as infantry. He did it as artillery. So a lot of this comes from a book which is entitled David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants by Malcolm Gladwell. And he wrote in the book, Goliath was expecting a warrior like himself to come forward for the duel, for hand-to-hand combat. It never occurred to him that the battle would be fought any other way. And so when David got there, Goliath was insulted and said, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? So Goliath's first reaction was to be insulted, but really he should have been terrified. Historian Robert Dorenwind says, Goliath had about as much chance against David as he would have against a modern opponent with a .45 caliber handgun. So does this mean that God didn't perform a miracle? Well, he did perform a miracle, but it might not have been quite the miracle that we think it was. It could be the miracle was that David was in the right place to hear Goliath's taunt, and that God gave David the courage to come to Saul and say, how can we let this Philistine get away with insulting God and his armies? And it could have been also that the miracle was that God gave Saul the courage to send a weak young kid out who can't even walk around in armor and trust the fate of the nation of Israel to that kid. Gladwell continues and he writes, the fact of being an underdog can change people in ways that we often fail to appreciate. It can open doors and create opportunities and educate and enlighten and make possible what might otherwise have seemed unthinkable. So how does that relate to us? The subject I have today is called strength through weakness. Strength through weakness. If you think about it, it's easy to see David's weaknesses because he was young and he was weak. He couldn't walk around in the armor. He obviously would have gotten crushed by Goliath if he had fought Goliath's game. So if David wouldn't have had that weakness, what would have happened? He would have been able to wear the armor. He would have gone out and fought just like Goliath with the armor and the sword, and he would have gotten crushed. But because David had that weakness, he was not even able to compete in that arena, so he fought his own fight, and he won. So God turned his strengths into weakness, his weakness into strength. Getting mixed up. And that's not the only time that God does that. God does that over and over again in the Bible, turning our weaknesses into strengths. If you think about Paul in 2 Corinthians 12:9, 2 Corinthians 12:9, this is Paul's thorn in the flesh that he had. We don't know what exactly it is, but Paul wanted it to go away and prayed. Verse 9 says, "And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." So his weakness became a strength. Paul was an elite. He was educated by elite rabbis. He had this great position. He was probably pretty smart, well-versed in the scriptures. It would be easy for him to get full of himself and boast and think of himself as better. But God gave him something that helped him. He gave him that thorn in the flesh to make him more effective at his job so that those things didn't happen. So God turned that weakness into a strength for the Apostle Paul. In 1 Corinthians 15:9, we see something else that could have been a weakness of Paul, and that is that he was the murderer of Christians. Paul was the murderer of Christians. 1 Corinthians 15:9, we read, "For I am the least of the apostles, who am not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain, but I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God which was in me." So God could have called Paul before he took the first Christian life, but God let him have those experiences. And apparently those experiences affected Paul in a way that it was part of his mind, not that he necessarily felt guilty because he knows that God can forgive, but he worked even harder knowing what his background is, what he did, and he worked even harder serving God's people as an apostle. Think of other times in the Bible where God takes a weakness and turns it into a strength. Think of Gideon's army. If Gideon had an army that was stronger than the Midianites, then it would have been easy. When he defeated the Midianites, you would have read in the paper the next day, well, big army defeats small army. You wouldn't have thought anything of it, right? But God had him turn his large army into a small army, and then turn his small army into an even smaller army. And then everybody who heard about the battle knew exactly what happened, which is there's no way that 300 people defeated all those people just on their own. That was God's hand. So many times in the Bible, God says, "And then you'll know that I am the Lord after I have done such and such." That's what God wanted. He didn't want just Army A to defeat Army B. He wanted people to look and see his hand in what happened. And by choosing an army and whittling it down to 300, that's the effect that he got. Even Jesus himself got a weakness by becoming a human, right? He shed himself of his immortality and he became weak. But that weakness is now a strength for him because he can understand us and relate to us in a way that he couldn't before, right? The Bible says that we have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses, and he can do that in a unique way because he himself was weak just like us. So what about us? Is he taking us? Is he making our weaknesses into strengths? Well, yes, he is. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 27. 1 Corinthians 1:27. "But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are." If you had bodies that didn't die, and you were always healthy, there would be no need for God. I remember Mr. Nylander in our congregation would tell me, he said, "Old age is God's last attempt to teach us humility." And I guess that's true. And for me, I didn't have this issue when I started writing this, but I ended up hurting my back a few days ago, and essentially I'm dependent on the kindness and help of other people at certain times, and my my humility, I hope I'm not bragging about my humility, but I think maybe it's a little higher than it was before I had this issue. So think about your weaknesses. We're all imperfect, weak human beings, and we are that way by design. So do you have weaknesses that help you empathize with other people better? Or do you have weaknesses that help you remember how you need God in a better way? God is working with each of us just like he was working with Paul, just like he was working with David. And he gives us what we need, including weaknesses. So God says to all of us, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness.